ICE is, to be blunt, completely and totally out of control. To say that I'm angry is not the right word. I don't have the right word for how I feel about it. I'm sure how Attorney General Brown feels about it, or how people all across our country feel about it. It's outrageous in the extreme, and it has to stop.
Some strong words there from Governor Bob Ferguson as Washington State looks to protect itself from the possibility of a ramped-up federal immigration crackdown. This after the second shooting death in Minneapolis involving an ICE agent. What is happening at the state level? What are local immigrant rights networks doing in the city of Seattle? We are looking at that issue and also looking at a series of shakeups in Seattle city government as Mayor Wilson assembles a new team around her, plus some new concerns over human trafficking in Seattle and so much more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel, and the views expressed here are mine. I am back once again with my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David's on the move today. I appreciate you doing this from the car. And I did want to make sure I asked this question. I know we talk a lot about baseball, but it is definitely football time here with the Seahawks headed to the Super Bowl. Did you predict the Seahawks to get this far in the playoffs last fall? Did you have that sense about this team?
No, not at all. I would be lying if I said I did. But I think that's probably the case for most people. I don't know that I saw anyone predict that they would be in the Super Bowl. So it's good company, and it's a fun surprise.
Absolutely. I'm with that for sure. David, thank you so much. And thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Patrons, appreciate your support as always. Thank you very much. If you're not a patron yet, please do consider it. You can get Patrons First podcast before anybody else. You can even get a cool Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. Check it out. The whole Megillah. Giving levels start at a mere $5 per month. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon, please. Thanks also for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's do this. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, David, we have a second shooting death in Minneapolis. Alex Preddy killed by ICE agents in what appears to be a wild scene in Minnesota. The governor and attorney general here in Washington state are responding this week with a few different approaches, including urging the legislature to quickly pass a bill that's been talked about at the city of Seattle level, prohibiting law enforcement officers from wearing masks, as ICE agents often do. And David, as we talked about last week, cities and states can't really do anything to block immigration officers, the federal immigration officers, from doing their jobs. But there may be a few legal avenues to work with as a way to push back. I just wanted your take on what the AG and the governor are saying, and also maybe some thoughts about where the Trump administration is on this issue, because it appears the president may be trying to do some damage control in Minnesota. What's your take on what's going on?
Unlike, I would say, in the first Trump administration, the posture we're hearing a bit from local officials, both in Seattle and at the state level, is a little more proactive rather than passive. For a while, that was kind of what it meant to be a sanctuary city or sanctuary state, is we will not participate in these operations. Now it's starting to take on a little bit more tone of we may take some steps to make this difficult for ICE. So, you know, that includes the face mask proposal. There's also a bill in the legislature that would bar police departments from hiring ex-ICE agents. I kind of doubt that'll pass, and I question its legality, but the fact of its existence, I think, is indicative. And, you know, during the press conference, a reporter, and I'm not sure who it was, asked, could local law enforcement actually make arrests of ICE agents?
Yes,
and
right.
Attorney General Nick Brown didn't say yes, but he also didn't say no. I highly doubt that it would ever come to that. But, you know, if you're in a situation where you're barring ICE from wearing face masks, the question after that is who enforces that? And Governor Ferguson talked about, you know, calling up the National Guard as a buffer between the public and ICE. And so you have this rhetoric that implies that the state may explore ways in which it can actually try and disrupt some ICE operations, while also saying, you know, there's nothing really they can do to prevent them from being in Washington state. You know, I'll say on a broad level, you know, because there's been a lot of this over the last year, which is if ICE comes, we may do this when, you know, kind of a lot of speculation. And I think, you know, the reason for that is because the entire Minneapolis St. Paul operation, its rationale is really political rather than anything else, because, you know, if the goal was to find as many people living in the country as possible who are undocumented, you wouldn't go to Minneapolis. That's not the location where there are, you know, there are more undocumented people living in Washington state than there are in Minnesota. Its origins have to do with this kind of sweeping fraud investigations having to do with the Somali community, which most people in the Somali community are here legally. So there's not actually a great nexus there between those two things. And so as a result, it creates this kind of unease and uncertainty of what is going to be the next political thing that's going to trigger an ICE operation? And
Yeah.
what is it that Governor Ferguson will say or Seattle will do that will catch the federal administration's eye and have them send more, do a similar operation here in Washington state. And so then we're kind of in this situation like we are today where, you have Governor Ferguson and Attorney General Nick Brown up there saying, if this happens, we will consider legal action. But it all feels a little obtuse because just no one knows anything about what the rationale is behind when these operations show up. And so therefore it feels like we're always kind of in this state of limbo and hypotheticals in a place that I think is a little uncomfortable for local lawmakers and a lot of people who live here.
Yeah, and just looking at the political reality and the legal reality here, too, because I think there was a big issue that Governor Ferguson and A.G. Brown talking about this legal challenge that they're planning to a leaked federal directive that says ICE agents can enter homes without judicial warrants. I know this is an issue around the country, but Ferguson, of course, a former AG himself, and Brown are saying they want to pursue every legal option to hold the federal government accountable and individual ICE agents. I think that's an important change there, too. I just come back to this point, though. It just doesn't appear the threat of a lawsuit has ever really held the Trump administration back from anything. I just wanted a last touch on this announcement of a potential legal challenge here and some thoughts about that.
No, it hasn't ever constrained the Trump administration. Really the only thing that I think has constrained the Trump administration is perhaps political support or broad public opinion. And, the reason I think the Trump administration doesn't care that much about legal fights is a lot of times I think they think those legal fights are good for them. I think particularly on, say, trans people in the military or trans people in sports, the Trump administration clearly thinks that is a good cultural issue for them. And so
fight.
I'm not convinced they particularly care about the final result of the policy. And I think a lot of times they welcome these kind of fights from blue state lawmakers because they think it is good for them. I think in this case, that is no longer the case, which is it's pretty clear that public opinion is turning against these operations. And so I don't know that they will welcome a kind of high profile legal fight over this in the same way that maybe they do some issues because, immigration is supposed to be Donald Trump's strength and polling is showing it's slipping pretty rapidly. We haven't seen I don't think any real change in on the ground reality, but we're hearing a little bit of a change in tone. And so therefore maybe the threat of a legal and drawn out fight from somewhere like Washington might actually carry a little more favor than it has in the past.
Yeah, definitely something to watch unfolding here in the state of Washington and in the state of Minnesota, too, as Greg Bovino has been pulled out there, the head of the Border Patrol, Tom Homan, with Homeland Security heading in. So a lot happening there. Of course, we'll keep track of it here on the podcast. I did want to point out, too, the governor was also talking about having ongoing meetings with local elected leaders here in Seattle and elsewhere about the state's response. And he's also called in the State Office of Immigrant and Refugee Assistance to his cabinet meetings to make sure that their voices are heard. As it turns out, City of Seattle is discussing the same issue this week in a Wednesday meeting of the Libraries, Education, and Neighborhoods Committee with its own Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. David, I was looking at the city's presentation on this, and it's clear helping immigrants a key for Seattle leadership. They put $300,000 towards helping immigrant families into last year's supplemental budget. But despite the legal resources available, I'm seeing two major communication challenges here. One, it's a lot harder to get in touch with immigrants who are actually in federal custody now. That's a reality. And then from a preventive standpoint, it's just hard to get in touch with immigrant communities at all in Seattle right now. You have many families not sending kids to school, not going to appointments simply out of fear. And I wanted to get your thoughts about that.
And there's maybe a third piece, which we'll get into actually in a later segment, which is there has been a leadership change.
Yeah, that's right too. Yeah, good point.
No, I think that's real. And I think that, again, the Trump administration and Trump himself have always built his identity and their identity around this immigration question. I mean, it's how he announced his run for president in 2015. But this is still a big difference in that in his first administration, they did basically respect the kind of boundaries that have long existed in immigration operations around safe places like hospitals and courthouses and churches and schools. And, the thought behind that was always that if you target people in those places, it's going to have a net negative effect because people will not seek out services. They will not, participate in society. If there's a crime, they will not report it.
That's right.
Just becomes disadvantageous to have people too scared to participate in some basic public goods or however you want to describe it. But this second administration has not respected those lines. And I think the result is we are seeing people retreat away from society in a way that I think is not good for them. It's not good for society writ large. And I think the Seattle is going to run into some of that, which is, sure, we can offer support, but how many people right now feel comfortable, even in a place like Seattle, stepping up and saying, yes, I would like to have direct communications with a government entity right now and accept, probably put my name down on a piece of paper. I think that is a tall ask that, is not a hypothetical. We've seen heard a lot of stories about ICE and Department of Homeland Security mining government sources to find people.
But what avenues could the city actually take to help immigrant communities in the city here? I'm just trying to figure this out, because I'm sure that's a question that's going on the second floor and the seventh floor of City Hall right now. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like how they could actually get that help to immigrant communities that need it?
Yeah, probably contracting, and I think they do a lot of that already, which is, it's not direct outreach from the city of Seattle. You are touching base with trusted sources and people and organizations that have built up relationships over many, many years. And
within those communities, those immigrant communities.
Yeah, within those communities. And you help them to the extent that you need, and then let them do the kind of one-on-one personal work. Seems like probably the best way, which is put a little bit of separation between these immigrant communities and the official halls of city government.
Yeah, a challenge for sure, though, of course. All right, up next, more new faces for the Wilson administration as new department heads just keep on coming. We'll discuss what's happening next on Now Hear This. More changes in leadership at Seattle City Hall last week. A half dozen new department heads named by Mayor Katie Wilson. This following the changes she made in leadership the week before that for the Department of Transportation and Seattle City Light. Beyond the usual whims of a political candidate taking office, what's motivating Katie Wilson to make these changes? She spoke about the critical personality traits she was looking for in the team surrounding her during her inauguration on January 2nd.
The most important thing is character. Someone might share my vision and my worldview. They might be competent and experienced and effective. But if they're not in this work for the right reasons, if they don't have enough self-awareness to reflect on their own motivations and rise above themselves when needed, then that's not a person that I should put in a position of power.
Well, David, you wrote about these changes in the Seattle Times, and there were a lot of them in terms of leadership here. We're talking about new leaders for the Department of Neighborhoods, the Office of Arts and Culture, Economic Development, Sustainability and the Environment, Office of Housing, Seattle Parks and Rec, too. Were you surprised at the number of changes here?
I was a bit, partially because of what we had heard from Mayor Wilson leading into this, which is, in my mind, and maybe I misheard her or misinterpreted her, but I felt like she was setting an expectation that there might not be a lot of turnover. She talked a lot about how she values experience, how she wasn't going to make political decisions, just being a friend or supporter of former Mayor Harrell's wasn't going to immediately result in your firing. And just because you supported her in the campaign doesn't guarantee you a spot in her administration. She
kept the fire chief. She kept the police chief. It's important.
She kept the fire chief. She kept the police chief. Yep. Those are big. And those were some of the first decisions you made. And so, and she also kept Tanya Kim in human services and Dwayne Chappelle in education. And some of those were her first decisions. And so it felt like the trend was toward a little more continuity than change. I figured she would change transportation, and I figured she would change housing, because those are kind of big priorities of hers and often see change. But the extent of the change did surprise me. And I would say that, this wasn't the news last week, but I would say the department that surprised me the most was probably City Light. Don Lindell was pretty widely supported among the unions, which is not a guarantee. This is management. And so there's an inherently tense relationship between unions and management. So to have the unions come out and say and tell me after this decision that they were not happy with this decision, that they felt like they had a good working relationship with Don Lindell. A few of them told me that they were not asked or consulted on this decision and didn't really have any input into the replacement. What's his name? Dennis McLaren.
Yes.
So that surprised me in part. And also because, there's just a lot for City Light to do, and finding, that's a hard job. There tends to be a lot of turnover. Not everybody succeeds in that job. Don Lindell seemed to be doing okay, at least from the outside. And so by making that switch, Mayor Wilson has set up a pretty tall task for herself. And that, for my money, was never, part of her campaign in a substantive way. Some of the other changes don't surprise me at all. Like I said, Office of Housing, I expected there to be change there. I do think we're hearing some questions about the way in which these changes have happened, similar to City Light, people feeling, and including certain members of the council, feeling like they were not given a heads up in a real substantive way, which I think is expected, which is that they get kind of warnings before this happens, and then it's made public. They're saying, I've talked to a few members who have said they found out about these changes in the news. And then again, some of the unions, the MLK Labor was pretty frustrated about the City Light change. And so, this is always a tense thing because, Mayor Wilson won the election, so she has the right to do this. And she has the right to build her administration and have the people around her that she feels comfortable working with.
And is she going to check with everybody before she makes these decisions? I mean,
no, exactly. Yeah, and who's to say? Maybe the unions have had too much power in the past, and she feels like that's again, there is real latitude for a new mayor. At the same time, she is the boss of a major bureaucracy, and whatever you want to call it, the deep state or public service. To a certain extent, she has to work with the people beneath her, and so there is a balancing act. And this is not just true for her; it's true for every new mayor, which is you have to balance kind of the opinions of the workers beneath you versus kind of your political agenda and the direction you want to go. And the reality is there has not been a mayor like Katie Wilson in a long time, if ever. And she is in some ways uncomfortable position of to do the things that she promised on the campaign trail. She's going to, I think, frustrate a lot of longtime city employees. And I think we're hearing that from some of the decisions made here, and yet maybe that's what the city needs. It's too early to say kind of how these will end up playing out.
Of course. I did want to touch on briefly because on a story that you wrote recently for the Seattle Times about what former Mayor Harrell is doing now. You actually pointed out that he left office with more years of city leadership experience than the current mayor, city attorney, and council, minus interim Deborah Juarez, combined. What did you learn? What was the genesis of that story? Talk about that.
Yeah, it felt like we need a little bit of closure with former Mayor Harrell. We hadn't really had that. The conversation was trying to get him to reflect on his administration. And frankly, he didn't really want to do that in a public way, which I think is, consistent with who he is.
Yeah,
He's a very confident person. He proclaimed quite bluntly that he thinks he was a good mayor. I was an effective mayor, is what he said. And he has this philosophy about governance, which is that no one should ever see him sweat, that he should, he is kind of, he invests a lot in how he appears to the outside world. He thinks that's very important to the position and to running a staff. And so I think as a result, it can be difficult for him to say, we screwed this up. We should have done this better.
Yeah.
Because he is not one, maybe he thinks that to himself, but he's never one to say that out loud. And for him, that's a strength. I think for other people, it can come across as a little arrogant at times. But, I would say in his retirement, however you want to call it, he is sounding pretty similar to me as how he did as mayor, which is, to the extent that there are failings, they are more systemic than they are my own personal failings. And the successes are mine and the result of me being a good leader, I think is his main interpretation of his mayoral administration. He wasn't interested in doing a lot of introspection on why he lost or what he could have done better. He felt like he did what he wanted to do, and the results were the results.
Yeah, fair enough. Interesting piece, though. Thank you for writing that. I do want to switch gears completely here to another city issue this week taken up by the council, the challenge of human trafficking. So this was in Councilmember Kettle's Public Safety Committee meeting on Tuesday morning. And as we heard in the meeting here, this is a persistent problem. Seattle's right in the middle of a crisis, really, here on the West Coast. What's new in the fight here, two bills going through the state legislature right now. House Bill 2526, which would elevate patronizing a prostitute from a misdemeanor to a felony with increased fines directed to survivor services. That's big. Then there's Senate Bill 5936, targeting businesses that enable trafficking, hotels, things of that nature. David, I just wanted to touch on this quickly. If the legislature passes these pieces of legislation, what kind of impact do you see that having? It just seems like legislators, law enforcement, they've been throwing so many things at this issue over the past several years, and it doesn't seem to have made a dent in it.
Yeah, I'll say, we always, it feels like we always hear a lot about prostitution around particularly big sporting events. It seems like there's always a big conversation around it with the Super Bowl. And so not surprising that there's some conversation happening as a result of the World Cup, that is slightly tied to the World Cup's arrival here.
Yeah, they want a big public information campaign when the Cup is in town, for sure.
Making it a felony, well, I mean, for one, it would change who is prosecuting these, at least in Seattle. And that is significant. This question of how the city should address prostitution there's been a bit of a pendulum swing back and forth. For a long time, the city really followed this, they called it the Nordic approach, which was you only go after the quote Johns and you don't go after the sex workers. There was a bit of a shift back. At least there were some arrests of actual people working as sex workers on Aurora.
Yeah.
I don't know what the kind of consistent pattern is now, but the reality is this was often a kind of policy debate within the city attorney's office. To make it a felony would kick that over to the King County prosecuting attorney. I think that office has always been a little more, well, I don't know if I want to say that, but that I think that would just change the conversation about who is really leading that criminal justice approach to prostitution.
Right. Do you get the sheriffs involved and so forth? Right.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I don't know what it means for the mostly women who are out there, how that would kind of change the approach to them. So, this is always a very tense topic. I think a lot of people still look back to the shutdown of online solicitation of sex, and there seems to be some correlation with that turning to an explosion of more kind of street level prostitution. There's always going to be a back and forth about whether law enforcement is the best approach to helping people in these situations. Seattle has discussed at least a sort of shaming campaign, basically, which is, they'll take pictures of men and people in cars soliciting sex along Aurora, and then sending them letters to their home and saying, "Hey, we saw you. Don't keep doing this."
Right. But real quick on this, I'm thinking about the city attorney Erica Evans coming into office here, and she is really not supportive of this stay out of areas of prostitution law that the council passed last year. And I just wanted to touch on that and how that could change the calculus here. Any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen the latest information on how much that is being used. Last we checked, it wasn't being used a lot. That doesn't necessarily mean that the threat of it wasn't having some kind of effect. But the message coming out of this office is certainly, we don't really support using these as much
as a tool.
I will say that my sense is that the frustration of people who live in that area is greater than it has been, at least in my memory. I think there's been a lot of people saying, look, it's gotten really bad up here. I know there's been a lot of violence. Whether or not cracking down on the actual act of soliciting sex is the way to clamp down on that violence, I don't know. Again, this is one of the most white hot debates over what is the best way to address this issue. Is it a strictly law enforcement effort? Is it a sort of more harm reduction approach? You find, again, I think that's the argument for more online solicitation of sex, which is kind of a harm reduction one. And I don't know that I see any one philosophy winning out right now, or the city or the county or the state coalescing towards any one singular approach right now.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Making different arrests for prostitution might touch on what's going on when it comes to sex trafficking and human trafficking here along the West Coast, but it's just one part of it. Part of it is definitely staying in the shadows, too. So a discussion I know we'll continue to have here, David. Thank you very much. All right, coming up, we're talking about a surge in downtown Seattle visitors. Well, that's coming your way. Talking about that in our next segment. What's next? David, I was looking at some news from the Downtown Seattle Association this week. The numbers have been crunched, and guess what? This past holiday season in downtown Seattle, there was a 97% increase in the number of visitors compared to 2019, pre-pandemic. DSA has been ramping up its game with 47 holiday events, including a new Pines on Pike tree lot event this year that looked like it was successful. The annual tree lighting was huge, brought in 16,000 visitors in late November, accounting for $500,000 in economic activity on one day alone. I wanted to talk about this, David, and what these numbers say to you about the health of downtown, or maybe it's a changing face of downtown, because the city of Seattle still has the dubious record of a 26.6 office vacancy rate downtown, which is number 2 in the country. Some thoughts about these numbers and where they're going.
Yeah, I think it is a continuation of something we've seen for a while, which is that tourism appears to be returning quite robustly, and kind of, the Pike Place Market is showing really good numbers. I know that there's been a ton of focus on the waterfront. The cruise ship industry has been doing pretty well. And so for events, like if you're kind of tying it to specific events or people's willingness to come downtown to celebrate something, I do think those numbers have all looked pretty good. Like, as you alluded to, I think the deeper challenge is the kind of more sustainable day in, day out numbers of who is commuting into downtown and office vacancies. And in some ways, those feel like two different issues. I think it's why we hear from a lot of elected officials or policymakers or, advocates saying, we need to create a more events, experiential driven economy in downtown. We need more bars, restaurants, things that, which in some ways is an acknowledgement that the office culture of downtown is probably not returning, frankly. And so the substitute is more stuff like what we saw with the holiday events, which is how do we get people to come downtown for other reasons, for more enjoyment? How do we, you're done with work. Maybe you still work remotely, but you're done with work. And, rather than going to Capitol Hill to meet friends for happy hour, you might actually want to go downtown.
Yeah.
How do you do that? It's much easier said than done.
It's an interesting, just quickly, it's an interesting dynamic. I just remember growing up in Los Angeles area in Southern California, that downtown was total office central. Like when 5 o'clock happened, everybody cleared out. But then they put in the Staples Center back there, dating myself, late 90s, can't remember. And it did turn into, what used to be nobody downtown in the evening, turned into a pretty hopping spot. So it's an interesting dynamic just having to try to balance these things, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say downtown Seattle has always been the former, much more office driven. Downtown Seattle was always set up for a moment like this has been set up for a moment like this for some years because so much of it, I'm thinking of Pacific Place and Nordstrom, and you've got these big brick and mortar shops that eat up huge proportions of downtown.
Yeah.
And, I think as a result, with online commerce and everything, it was almost inevitable that there was going to be some reckoning with that at some point. COVID just sped it up a lot quicker, so it happened faster than we thought. And so I think in 2019, there was some recognition like, hey, we need to slowly make this shift towards some other reason to be downtown. And then COVID sped that up. And now they're trying to figure out how to do that on the fly, which is much less comfortable.
Yeah. A lot ahead for downtown. Very interested to see how Katie Wilson deals with that as mayor. I know that John Scholes of the Downtown Seattle Association was on her transition team. So certainly something that she's keeping her tabs on, and the DSA is keeping its tabs on too. I do need to wrap up with you here, David. I have a Seattle neighborhood question that's been vexing me, could use your help. So in my neighborhood in West Seattle, there's a certain neighbor who has not a little book library. You've seen those around, those little things on the sidewalk, but a little baked goods library.
Oh, wow.
So this is crazy. You don't return the baked goods. You roll by, you pick them up, and you eat them when you're walking around the neighborhood. And it's an incredible neighborhood perk, I have to say that. But I'm struggling with the old concept of don't take sweets from strangers. But does that cautious approach change if it's a warm chocolate chip cookie in a paper wrapper with a really nice chalkboard announcement right next to it? Help me out. What do you got?
I would eat the chocolate chip cookie without hesitation. I have no willpower, so if I saw it, I would eat it, and I would take the risk. It would be worth it. If I'm going to go out, eating a chocolate chip cookie is not a bad way to go.
I like it, yeah. And this comes back to the movie we need to write about the best way to poison all the newsrooms in the United States. Put out that plate of chocolate chip cookies on the desk. They'll figure it out. All right. Well, David, thank you very much as always for joining me, and thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. If you are able, please become a patron, support the show. Head to Patreon online, find Seattle News, Views, and Brews, pledge $5 per month or more, and thank you for the support. Thanks for listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you are listening, including overseas. Top 3 countries this week for downloads: Germany, Japan, and Canada, eh? Love it. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.